Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Toronto Apologetics. My name is Tony Costa, and it's great to have you along. And thank you again for all my subscribers who been faithfully following and supporting the ministry. Really appreciate you guys. And as you probably know, Toronto Apologetics is dedicated to the defense of the Christian faith, and we deal with a wide array of subjects from systematic theology to philosophy to biblical history, biblical archaeology. We deal with biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and so on. And we are basically a general apologetics platform where we like to deal with various topics on a general level. And so that's why you'll notice some of my guests specialize in various fields. And so tonight, it's a great privilege, it's a great honor to have a dear brother in Christ, a colleague, Dr. Daniel Wallace. Dr. Wallace, welcome to my channel. It's a great honor, sir, to have you on.
Well, thank you, Tony, and it was great to see you in Boston a few weeks ago too.
Yes, it was, and it was nice meeting with many of our friends, our common friends that you and I have, and also to meet even various presenters, PhD candidates, and so forth. And I had a great time, and it was such a blessing to meet you. The first time I met you, Dan, was in Boston way back in early 2000s, I think. And
okay.
I was with Michael Licona, and Michael and I were studying under the same doctoral supervisor, Jan van der Watt.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And so we both studied under him. Mike got his doctorate first, and then I got it about 2-3 years later. I got mine. But it was such a blessing to meet you, Dan, and I just love your work. And you're basically the go-to when it comes to the Greek New Testament.
Well, that's saying way too much, giving me way too much credit. But nevertheless, Jan van der Watt is a terrific scholar. I didn't realize you got your doctorate under him.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And he, as you know, he was with the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And then he went over to the Netherlands to Radboud University. And that's where I studied with him. That's where I went and did my doctoral defense there. As quite an experience, to be sure. Dan, I also wanted to mention you have this, of course, your great book, The Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. And I noticed that you had a post that it was on sale, I believe.
Yeah,
maybe a little bit about that, because this is the standard that some of my students use as well. But can you say a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's been translated into half a dozen languages, and it has become the standard intermediate and advanced grammar in the English-speaking world for New Testament students. It's for sale on Amazon at a price that is better than I can get at a 50% author's discount. They're selling it for less than $25 right now.
Wow.
And it retails for $60. So I actually found out about this a few weeks ago. They were actually limiting it to 3 per person. And so I immediately bought 3 because I can't get them that cheap, so I can give them to friends. So
yeah. So guys, this would be a great Christmas gift to pass on to your friends. And so I would encourage you to get it. It is really, it's helped me. When I did my doctoral studies, it was a tremendous help to me in dealing with the New Testament text. And so I would encourage you to get Dan's book on that subject. So again, Dan, thank you for coming on. And we wanted to talk a little bit tonight about the importance of textual criticism. And many Christians tend to be very suspect or suspicious of textual criticism, especially those who hold to a view that there's only one standard of the Bible. For example, the King James Version is the only acceptable version. Can you help? What can we do, or how can we help Christians to see the importance of textual criticism and not see it as an enemy of the Bible and the Christian faith?
That's a great question. There's a number of ways I could approach this, but let me start with the 15th century. when Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, 1454 approximately. Before that, all books, all literature had to be copied by hand. And consequently, all of it had mistakes. Every single copy had mistakes in it. Sorry, I have to keep muting the microphone because I've got a bit of a cough coming off of a cold right now, but hopefully none of the people watching are going to catch my cold. So until the 1500s, really, we didn't have any books printed, we didn't have any Bibles printed so that you could have the same copy multiplied over and over and over again. If you wanted to know any literature from the ancient world, you had to do textual criticism to try to determine what the original wording was. This is true of all Greco-Roman literature. It's even true of quite a bit of modern literature. For example, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. We have, I believe, 5 copies of it, handwritten copies by his assistants, and then we have a number of newspaper reports on what he said, and what he wrote on the back of an envelope. We no longer have that. We have to do textual criticism to find out exactly what he said. As far as we can tell, he did not invoke the name of God in what he originally wrote, but he did when he spoke. So there's even this oral tradition of who's the real Gettysburg. Is he what he wrote or what he spoke? And I'm sorry, the real Lincoln. Already, this is just Thursday and my mind's messed up. But that's a little different situation from what we have with the New Testament. With the New Testament, what you've got is the original is what was dispatched from the author. It's not a written text and then an oral tradition that follows that. It's that written text. Once it's dispatched, that's considered the original text. Now, it got copied. 27 books got copied by various scribes for many, many centuries, and we have a small amount of those copies left, not nearly as many as there originally were, just a small percentage of those, and yet we have thousands of them, and they all differ from one another. Now, when you had somebody like Erasmus, who was the first scholar to print or to publish a Greek New Testament on the printing press in the year 1516, he did it based on 9 manuscripts that he had access to, all of them late, all of them second millennium manuscripts, nothing from before AD 1000. And his first edition did not have what we call the comma Johanneum. That's this passage at 1 John 5:7 that's in the King James Bible, where it says, there are 3 who bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one. And then it goes on, it says, there are 3 who bear witness on earth, the water, the blood, the water, the Spirit, and the blood, I think is the order. Let me just pull that up real quickly. Well, now let's I want to get the quote exactly right for my King James only friends. Okay. For there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one, is what's in the King James Bible. And there are 3 that bear witness in earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these 3 agree in one, is what you have in the King James Bible. Now, that was not in Erasmus's first edition of 1516. His second edition came out in 1519, and he got a strong reaction from Catholic scholars in Leuven, Belgium, and in England. And they were objecting to his Greek text because it did not have this Trinitarian statement that they said existed in some of the manuscripts, and they thought it was original. So he said, I did not put it in because I couldn't find it in any manuscripts. He never made the promise that he would put it in if he did find it in any manuscripts. But he did say, I didn't put it in because I didn't find it in any manuscripts. Well, apparently, there seemed to have been a manuscript that was made to order that was done in 1520 by a man named Roy working at Oxford University. And he produced an entire Greek New Testament on paper. And Erasmus found out about that before his third edition, after the second edition of 1519. And Erasmus put the Comma Johanneum in his third edition because of what this text had to say.
Right.
Now, I've looked at that manuscript in quite a bit of detail, and it is the worst manuscript I've ever seen in terms of scribal fidelity, scribal mistakes. The handwriting, it's not by a professional scribe by any means. There's scratch outs, there's all sorts of things. And I even know one of the manuscripts that Roy probably used for the Catholic epistles. I checked it at First John when I was in Oxford. I looked at the manuscript that he most likely used. And when we got to First John chapter 5, verse 7, it did not say what Roy's text, what the third edition of Erasmus's text, what the King James Bible says. Instead, it had what all the ancient manuscripts say. Now, that Trinitarian formula, Erasmus said, I didn't put anything in because I didn't put it in because I couldn't find it in the manuscripts. But that was actually a little bit disingenuous, because he did not even put in what Roy had written, since Roy knew Latin better than he knew Greek. And consequently, Erasmus had to correct the Greek because he knew this was not from the Greek. It was a Latin back translation into Greek that Roy had done. Right. And Erasmus had to fix the Greek. So even then, he didn't put in what he had found in a manuscript. And Erasmus did the same thing with the last 6 verses of Revelation, because he had one manuscript for Revelation. And that was one that he borrowed from a friend. It lacked the last leaf of the Apocalypse. Now, these manuscripts were written on a codex, our modern book form, right? That it's bound on one side, and we have cut pages rather than a scroll like the first century books and before were all written on. So what Erasmus did, he's in a rush to get his Greek New Testament published before the Catholics in Spain were going to get theirs done. He didn't know what was going on with them, but he wanted to be the first to get the text published. And so what he did when he came to those last 6 verses is he grabbed a Latin text and he himself back translated from Latin into Greek, right, and created 20 textual variants in those last 6 verses that have not been found in any Greek manuscripts, except those that are dated after 1520 and are basically based on Erasmus's text, his text of Revelation, certainly. Right. So you look at this and you say, well, maybe textual criticism is something that we need to do to these ancient texts. Erasmus himself did it when he had these access to 9 manuscripts, and yet it was at the very early stages of studying the text, he had access to a couple of better manuscripts that he did not use because he wasn't sure if they were that accurate. And he thought one was late when actually it was the earliest of the 9 manuscripts that he had. It's called Codex 1. And he used that manuscript the least of all the manuscripts that he used. Now, the interesting thing is that since the time of the printing press, we've had a text that was printed over and over and over again. In 20 years of Erasmus's text until he died in 1536, over 300,000 copies of his Greek New Testament had been printed. And that became the standard by benign neglect, if you will. Who's going to challenge this and change the text? Well, verse numbers were not put in until 1551 with Stephanus, a French printer, who put the verse numbers in because he had Erasmus's text, which it always was a diglot. It always had Latin and Greek, and it became a triglot where he had in Stephanus's text, it had Erasmus's Greek text in the middle column, and Jerome's Latin on one side, and Erasmus's Latin translation on the other. And what Stephanus did is he put verse numbers in the margins. Now, he did that, but to show exactly where you were, he indented each verse as if it started its own paragraph with a new number. That's exactly what the King James translation did. It's exactly what the New American Standard did. And that has caused students of the Bible to proof text without looking at the context. So it was a necessity by Stephanus, but it certainly was not a necessity later on. So this illustrates that a particular format or a particular tradition about the text is often followed without having any of the reasons that were original to it. Like the New American Standard when it came out, and even to this day, there's some copies of it that do this. They put in italics words that are not there. Why?
Yeah.
Because they say we are following in the tradition of the King James, where it put in italics words that are not there. That's not what italics means today. Universally in English, they mean this is emphasis, not absence. So you've got those kinds of things that are happening with this. And Erasmus did have the story of the woman caught in adultery in his Greek text, and he had the long ending of Mark's gospel in his Greek text. But in his annotations, he questioned whether those were authentic. So even though he publishes something, he doesn't necessarily think everything that he's published is original. Certainly not the Trinitarian statement, and certainly not those last 6 verses of Revelation that he had to back translate from Latin. Textual criticism has been necessary from the beginning of the ancient world until today, anytime we're looking at documents prior to the time of the printing press. So we've had a false sense of confidence that what we have in a printed text, if it's just everybody has the same text, therefore that must be what the original said. That sense of confidence is not something that could have happened until the printing press. And because of the printing press, you've got people who are claiming that only the King James is inspired or only the Textus Receptus is, when anybody before 1454 never would have thought of anything along those lines. It's not at all rational, it's not historical, and it's not empirical.
Right. Yeah, very well said. And so textual criticism is important. It has its place, and it's not something that Christians should shy away from. It's something actually that we should accept. And, I'm sure you hear this too, Dan. I get this all the time about why was this verse removed? Well, it's not a matter of it being removed. It's a matter of it being inserted at a later time, either to harmonize it with another passage. And so what I find generally is that a lot of Christians assume that simply because a verse that they see in the King James Version is missing in, let's say, the New American Standard Bible, the ESV, they assume that there's this nefarious plot to remove the Word of God, and of course that's not the case at all. And right. I think it does more. I think it does more damage to the cause of Christ. And they tend to treat the Bible much like the Muslims do, with this idea of a preserved text, that the Quran is preserved, it's never been changed. And right. So I think that Christians really need to understand that textual criticism is not our enemy. It is, like you said, it's what people have been doing from antiquity, including Christians like Jerome and others.
Right. Jerome, Origen, others. And I'll even add this, that the Christian faith, although shrouded in mystery, is also grounded in history.
Yes.
And we do not have a faith that, we don't think that somehow God sent an email with an attachment from heaven down into a Zondervan warehouse where all the Bibles were printed. No, it was good men and women, faithful scribes, who copied the text over and over again for centuries, and they still all differed from one another. There are colophons at the end of some of these manuscripts where I've read them where one scribe said, this is Andrew who wrote this in this particular year. And then he says, if I've left anything out or added anything, this for the sake of Christ, please forgive me. And yet he knew he would. And he's trying to be careful, but he's also doing it on the basis of the manuscripts he has access to. Textual criticism is a part of that historical discipline. And if I can do this, let me add what's happened 200 years after Erasmus's text came out. So you have Erasmus, then Stephanus, who has 4 editions, and in his 1551 edition, that's when he put verse numbers in. There could never be any kind of a complaint about verses missing until verse numbers were added in the 16th century. So they're not original. So why would we think that that has to go back to the original necessarily?
Right.
200 years later, in the year 1707, John Mill, who was an Oxford scholar, he spent his entire adult life, his career, 40 years, 30 years, I think, working on looking at all the Greek manuscripts he had access to. It was 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts, ancient versions, ancient translations, and the church fathers. And he put together a very large volume text of the Greek New Testament with an apparatus where on virtually every page the apparatus is as long as, if not longer than, the text. So you've got the text, and then below the line, you've got the footnotes of the textual variants with the witnesses that attest those. When he did this, 2 weeks later to the day he died, which is perfect timing.
Yeah.
Because when I do my magnum opus, I want to die within a couple of weeks so I don't have to deal with all the critics who come out of the woodwork, But he didn't have to defend it. But 6 years later, there was a man who defended it, another scholar from Cambridge, Richard Bentley. And what was interesting about Mill's text, he had 30,000 texture variants that he discovered. Still, he published the Textus Receptus, the text that ultimately went back to Erasmus, because that was the only one that was being published up until another century and a half later. So when Richard Bentley came along, he wrote a book and he dealt with this, and he noted that Roman Catholics were gleeful about the fact that there were so many differences on every page on this Greek New Testament. And they said, you Protestants have a paper pope, but he disagrees with himself every page. Our pope speaks ex cathedra. Well, so they thought this was terrific. And there were conservative Protestant people who criticized Mill. They said he did the work of the devil. Now, I find that terribly ironic because, again, the Bible, our faith, is grounded in history. It's the only major document, or it's the only scripture of any major religion that subjects itself to historical verification. You don't have that in the Bhagavad Gita. You don't have it in the Quran. You don't have it in all sorts of these other religions here. The teachings of the compassionate Buddha or others. And in fact, it's the incarnation itself that puts a methodological stamp, a methodological imperative on us to do historical research.
Right.
The Bible is the only major book, only major scripture that says, test to see whether I'm true or not. And it speaks about places where this event happened, where this miracle happened. You can go to those places. You can see them. I've been there. I've been to Peter's house. I've seen where these four friends dropped down through the thatched roof of Peter's house, this paralytic right in front of Jesus. And we know where Jesus stood. We know where the man walked out because you still have the remnants of that house still intact to this day on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. So when you look at that, and then you look at these apocryphal books like the Gospel of Thomas and all these other apocryphal gospels and other things that came later, they're just talking heads. You don't have a single miracle in Thomas. You don't have a single place name. You don't have a river. You don't have any events that can be tied to historicity to tell whether it's true or false.
Right.
So I think that's remarkable that our faith is grounded in history. And for somebody to say the work of doing historical investigation is the work of the devil has just turned everything upside down.
Totally agree. I just want to thank Jason for his super chat. He says, I first saw Daniel Wallace's presentation at the Dig and Delve in Ottawa. Love the textual criticism. Do you remember that event, Dan? In Canada?
In Ottawa. Let's see, I've spoken in Canada a few times. I'm sure I spoke. Yeah, I do remember sort of, but not real clearly. I'm sorry.
Right. Well, that's okay. That's I'm getting to that stage too, Dan. So so it's not just me.
Well, you're not as old as I am. I'm forgetting what I had for breakfast yesterday. So.
I know. So Dan, just talking about the manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, and all the variants, when someone says, how can we be sure that we can recover the original, we don't have the autographs that Paul wrote Galatians, or Peter wrote his letters, or Jude or John, but how can we be sure? Because as you know, in academia, there's a lot of debate about whether we can even speak of an original text. Bart Ehrman's has been moving in this direction for a long time. So if a Christian were to say, with all of these variants that we have, how can we be sure that we have that original strata, that original that goes back to the apostles of Jesus? And how can we be sure that, do we have 99% of it, or is it 90% of it? How can we be sure that what I'm reading here today is the word of Jesus, whether it's the ipsissima verba or the vox Jesu? How can we be sure that this is the voice of Jesus? This is the words of Jesus?
That's a great question, and it's really getting to the nub of the whole issue here. Let me let's see how I want to address this. Well, let me begin with the problems we have. Our two closest manuscripts from the first eight centuries are P75 and Vaticanus. Yeah. And if they were complete manuscripts of the New Testament, they have between 6 and 10 differences per chapter where they overlap. If they were both complete New Testaments, that would be a couple thousand differences. Those are the two closest manuscripts from the first 8 centuries. All of our manuscripts have discrepancies. They all disagree with each other. We don't have the originals anymore. They must have disappeared no later than the end of the 2nd century. And Bart, at one point in one of his books, says, nobody knows why they disappeared. Well, I think we have a pretty darn good educated guess as to why they did. This was the lifeblood of the church. So you get a man who lives in Corinth, and he's going to Rome on a business meeting, and he says, I've got a scribe with me, and I understand that Paul wrote a letter to you Romans, and I've got 2 letters from Paul here in Corinth. I'd like to bring copies of those to you if I could have him copy out your text of Romans that Paul wrote to you. And this is how the early text would have been spread long before I think that the early church fully recognized that what they had was scripture. Now, I think they came to that realization with the Gospels pretty early on, but the rest of the New Testament, there was kind of a growing canon consciousness in the 2nd century. Right. So they're copying this repeatedly, and they're not protecting the manuscripts necessarily. They're letting them get frayed. People are making copies, and after a while, you start to get some professional scribes. But even our earliest scribes were not really professional. What they were, one scholar found this out back in his 1977 Schweik lectures, Colin H. Roberts, on the text in Egypt in the ancient world. And he pointed out that what was virtually unique among biblical Greek manuscripts, so the Septuagint and the Greek New Testament, is that when it came to numbers, there were a number of manuscripts, especially the earlier ones, that did not write the numbers out as words. They wrote them out as numbers, or in Greek, it would just be letters. There's alpha means 1 and iota means 10, this kind of thing. Right. So what he did is he said, I found only one literary document, a copy of a literary document where the number abbreviations were used instead of the full words. And yet there's plenty of New Testament manuscripts that do this. In fact, one of my students at Dallas Seminary, Zachary Cole, he came to me, and I had not had a class with him, but he said, I understand you have some ideas for a thesis. So I said, yeah, why don't you look at the manuscripts from the first 5 centuries to see whether they have numbers written out or are abbreviated. And so he did that, and then he discovered that I'm sorry, I'm getting into the details, getting too much into the weeds, but let me just say this. It was such a fascinating thing that he found that he went on to Edinburgh University, and under Paul Foster, he expanded on this topic in a couple of different directions and did his doctoral thesis under Foster at Edinburgh and found some amazing things. But here's the point. Those scribes who did not write out the numbers as words, but as abbreviations, were trained as accountants. They were not trained as professional scribes, so their hand would not necessarily have been a professional hand, but they were trained to copy things accurately as they could. And so Bart Ehrman likes to say, well, in the earliest century of copy, in the 2nd century, it was wild copy. He gets that from Helmut Christer, who said that years ago, and he doesn't really have any basis for that for the New Testament manuscripts. You had that in the classical period before the 3rd century BC, but in Alexandria, Egypt, there was a scholar who put together, Alexandria was the great intellectual center of the ancient world. It had the great Alexandrian library, and they claimed to have virtually every book that had ever been written in the Greco-Roman world. And this man came up with rules on how to do very careful copying. And if there's discrepancies between two manuscripts you're copying, you're supposed to make this kind of a note. And that was after all the classical texts from the classical period, the 3rd, 4th, 5th century and before BC. But the New Testament was copied after that. And our best manuscripts just happen to come from Egypt. They're not always the best, but the vast majority of the ones that come from Egypt are better than the vast majority of anything else. And that's because they followed these careful rules of copying from the get-go, from the very beginning. And even Ehrman, in his book with Bruce Metzger, the 4th edition of the text of the New Testament, said that from the earliest time, we have a very careful stream of transmission. And that careful stream of transmission is copied over and over again in Alexandria and its environment for the first several centuries. So I'd say on the basis of the kinds of scribes we had, on the basis of these Alexandrian witnesses in particular, but others as well, we can get pretty darn sure that we have close to the original wording. But that's not all. At the same time, apart from Alexandria, there were no controls in the copying. They didn't say, there was no center that said, you have to make this an exact copy like the Muslims claim the Quran was done, which is not at all true. But they didn't have that. It was as I said, these early people would come and copy the text for personal use and then for their churches and things. And because it was so diffuse, because it was so diverse, you could not control what these copies looked like. And because of that, it's that very reason that helps us to get back to the original. If we see a manuscript from the 4th century in this part of the world, and another one in this part of the Mediterranean, and another one from this part, as well as church fathers from the 4th century or the 3rd century or even the 2nd century, as well as ancient translations like Latin done in the late 2nd century as early as that, or Coptic and Syriac in the 3rd century. That's kind of a trifecta of evidence from these manuscripts from everywhere. And we don't have a lot from the early centuries, it's true, but we do have very good records of what the church fathers wrote and these translations into various different languages. And you can see from an examination of all this what the original text almost surely said. Okay, now that gives you a broad background. This is one of the things that skeptics like to say as well. We only have maybe at most about a dozen manuscripts from the 2nd century, and they're all fragmentary. I agree with that. Not a single papyrus is a complete manuscript of what was originally copied. And we have at most a dozen manuscripts from 100 to 200. But it's not just the manuscripts we're looking at. You have church fathers, beginning with Origen, who writes exhaustive commentary on John, and he makes comments on so many of the other books of the New Testament. And then you get Chrysostom from the 4th century, who writes on virtually every book, and other church fathers. These fathers are giving us, we can locate them in the regions, and we can find out what text they thought was original. And they talk about textual variants, especially Origen and Jerome. They say, I've seen some manuscripts that say this, but others say this. And I think this is the better text. I think it goes back to original. Even Irenaeus in the late 2nd century talks about what the original of Revelation 13:18 said.
Yeah.
So you've got this kind of evidence and the skeptics. When I've debated Bart Ehrman, he said, well, we don't have early copies of Mark. And so how can you tell what Mark originally said? And I'm thinking to myself, Bart, that's not all the evidence we look at. And he even said himself in misquoting Jesus, we have copies of Mark already in Matthew and Luke.
Yeah.
But then he makes the quantum leap that he should not make, that Matthew and Luke did the same thing that the scribes of Mark did, namely they conformed the text to their own particular leitmotifs, the theses that they wanted to get across.
Right.
And we just don't have evidence of the scribes doing that. Okay, so that gives that kind of evidence. Now, let me give you the bad news. We have approximately, the best evidence is that there are approximately 1.5 million verbal discrepancies in our Greek manuscripts alone. Now, that comes from, I won't give all the data. Probably your audience doesn't care about all these particular issues, but it's an article that Peter Gurry wrote in New Testament Studies, and he only dealt with 1/3 of the evidence. So it comes out to about, he said there's 500,000 variants, but there's about 1.5 million if you count all these discrepancies. The Greek New Testament originally had only about 138,000 words to it. So that means we've got almost 10 discrepancies for every word on average in our New Testament manuscripts. How in the world could we get back to the original if that's the case? Well, first of all, the vast majority of them are spelling differences or nonsense errors, and they affect nothing. They can't even be translated the same or translated differently. I've done a thought experiment with people where I've given a lecture on this several times, and I said, how many ways are there to say John loves Mary in Greek? Now, there's 2 different ways to spell John, and there's 5 different ways to spell Mary, but it always means John, and it always means Mary. And in Greek, as you well know, you can use the article before the name or not, and the word order can be anything it wants to be, using exactly the same word for loves each time. I counted 384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek.
Wow. Yeah.
But that, I realized, I spent 8 hours doing this one day to make sure I didn't have any duplicates. And then I realized, there's a bunch I left out. So it comes to about 500. And then I completely forgot about an entire other construction, paraphrastics. That brings it to about 1,000. There's 1,000 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek, where the Greek could be any number of things, but it's always translated John loves Mary.
Right.
That's just unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when people like Bart Ehrman say the discrepancies in our manuscripts are not in the hundreds, they're in the thousands and the hundreds of thousands. So what? If you could say John loves Mary 1,000 different ways in Greek and it can't even be translated differently, then who cares about how many differences there are? There could be tens of million. What it really matters is what's the nature of these differences and how viable are they? That is, what's the likelihood that they could go back to the original? Right. So I've come up with this matrix of meaningful and viable. And I've asked the question, let's put it into 4 categories. Those textual variants that are not meaningful, they don't change the meaning, and they're not viable. They don't have a chance of going back to the original. The vast majority of our variants fit into that. Right. Then there are those that are viable but not meaningful. That's where you're going to get the spelling differences that they can't change anything, but maybe it goes back to the original and nonsense errors. So those 2 categories, we have the vast majority of our differences in those 2. Then you've got those that are meaningful but not viable. Well, if you find something in, say, a 14th century manuscript, and it does change the meaning, but it doesn't have any possibility of going back to the original, then it's not viable. And there's a large number of readings that are like that. There's one that's really fascinating to me. It's in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, where Paul either says, we became gentle among you. speaking to the Thessalonians, speaking about himself and Silas when they were there. Or we became little children among you.
Yeah.
He either said, egonathiemon apioi, we became gentle, or egonathiemon napioi, we became little children. Now he's dictating this letter, and Silas is probably the scribe, and he's saying, egonathiemon napioi. What did he say? Apioi or napioi?
Right.
And Silas may have written it down wrong, then Paul would have corrected it, so it gets out there that way. But there's a late manuscript that doesn't have napioi, it doesn't have apioi. In fact, that's a really difficult textual problem for us to wrestle with. It's one of my favorites to deal with. But there's one very late manuscript all by himself, and the scribe wrote, egonathiemon hippoi. We became horses among you. Now, in a sense, it's meaningful. It's very comical, but it makes sense. But there's no way it's original. I mean, apioi and apioi, no, those are all wrong. We became horses among you. It must be a disgruntled USC Trojans football fan, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, horseplay.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So then when you look at the meaningful and viable category, that is far and away the smallest category of these discrepancies. It's less than 1/10 of 1% of all the discrepancies are both meaningful and viable. Now, are there places where we're not sure what the original said? Of course there are. And there may be a few hundred, but that's even an extreme assessment. Bruce Metzger, who was a conservative and evangelical scholar, perhaps the best New Testament textual critic of the 20th century, he was Bart Ehrman's mentor at Princeton Seminary, both for his, that's the 4th edition. Great text. So Ehrman studied under him at Princeton for his master's and his PhD. And Ehrman, over the years, drifted to the left, away from evangelicalism, to the point where today he's an atheist. But on page 252 of the paperback edition of Misquoting Jesus, the editors asked Ehrman, it's an appendix that was added to the paperback edition of Misquoting Jesus. We'll talk about this later, I suspect. They said, if you and your professor Metzger were locked in a room and you couldn't come out until you both worked through the differences you had about what the original New Testament said, how many differences do you think you would find? And Ehrman said, probably no more than a dozen or 2 dozen. That's it.
No.
Now, I gave a much larger number, but when he's looking at Bruce Metzger, with whom I would agree very much on text critical principles, he has only a couple dozen places where he disagrees. So what's really different about Ehrman is not how what his text looks like. It's the certainty that he places on it. And frankly, what he does is he is so skeptical that the evidence doesn't warrant that kind of skepticism.
Yeah, you're right, Dan. And talking about the early manuscripts, I have a facsimile here of P52. And our friend Wes Huff, he loves these facsimiles, and so you're talking about how easy it is for these papyrus to start breaking down over time. And so here we have, and I'm sure you've seen it at John Ryland's library. The
I've actually not been to Manchester University.
Oh, you haven't?
In time to see the actual manuscript. I've seen over 1,000 manuscripts, but not that one yet.
Yeah, but it's amazing how we got this little portion here from the Gospel of John, from the 18th chapter, what we call today the 18th chapter. And yet when they discovered that, that was revolutionary, because, as you know, John was dated, some of them dated John into the 3rd century, early 3rd century, and even beyond. But this little stamp size, credit card size little papyrus, P52, basically took it back towards the end of the 1st century. I mean, the dating for that is what, about 112 to 125, around there. Am I correct?
Well, what C.H. Roberts, the guy who I told you about on this Schweik lectures, he was the one who discovered it in 1934.
Right.
And he got it published in 35. And he did what's called comparando, where he's comparing it to papyri that have dates on it. And I've done that with a manuscript that Mike Holmes and Jeff Fish and I published in the Oxyrhynchus papyri. It's probably a late 2nd century text of the Sermon on the Mount and part of the Gospel of Thomas. It's the oldest manuscript we have of the Sermon on the Mount, any part of the Sermon on the Mount. So I looked at thousands of comparanda, dated manuscripts, and others that were pretty sure of what the date is. And the ones that I found that were closest to it in terms of the letter formation and other things, that's how I was able to determine what the date was. This is what Roberts did. And the closest manuscript that he found was actually dated 94.
Wow.
And then he found another manuscript that was the second closest. That was 152. So he said, I think it's between 100 and 150, but probably closer to the earlier date.
Right.
He sent photographs of P52 to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. And each one of them said, I agree. It's between 100 and 150 and probably closer to 100. And then Adolf Deismann, the German scholar, said, I think it might be in the 90s. So now in the last couple of decades, there's been some push backwards. There's scholars who say maybe it's 125 to 175, but I still think that Robert's initial dating is probably the most accurate, but it may not even be our oldest New Testament manuscript. There's a couple, 104, Papyrus 104, and some others that may even be older than that. Wow. But here's the interesting thing. In 1844, 90 years before Roberts published this, it was F.C. Bauer, who was the father of the Tübingen Liberal School in Tübingen, Germany. Yeah. He published in the Tübinger Jahrbuch, it's an annual that came out of the university, where he had studied under Professor Hengel at Tübingen. And Hengel is the one who came up with Hegel, not Hengel. I'm sorry, I always get those mixed up.
Frederick Hegel.
Hengel also taught at Tübingen, but that was in the late 20th century, early 21st. So back to Hegel. Hegel invented Hegelian dialectic. Now, not all your viewers are going to know what that is, but it's simply when you have thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, where they fight against each other and they come up with a synthesis. Now, what Bauer did is he applied this to the New Testament writings. And he said the Gospel of John is kind of a synthesis between Petrine, Peter's version of Christianity, and Paul's, which Peter's was very Jewish, Paul's was very Gentile, and John's kind of combines the two. Right. And he said this gospel could not have been written any earlier than 160, and probably 170 is the date he felt it was the right date. Yeah. That led most of Europe to late date John's gospel to the point that it became worthless historically until P52 was discovered. And that little fragment sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. Now,
this little thing here.
That little fragment. Is that what Wes Huff did? Did he make that one?
No. This is from a producer here in Niagara Falls in Canada. But it's a really very, very. I mean, if I didn't know better, I thought it was the original. But
it looks better than my copy.
I'll give you a close up there, Dan. You could take a look at it there.
That's great.
They're professionals, but they work out of Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada.
Well, send me that information later because I'd like to get some for the center. That'd be great.
We'll do.
Yeah,
we'll do. So, is there anything else you wanted to add, Dan, or you?
Let's see. Now where were we? We were talking about.
We were talking about
how certain we can be about the original wording.
Yeah, about the original.
So, when Bart and I had our second debate at Southern Methodist University in 2011, he was saying we have no idea what the original said, and we just it could be anything. And I pointed out that in the standard Greek New Testament that was used at the time, the Nestle-Aland 27th edition, the Nestle-Aland 28th came out the next year, but the 27th was the standard, and they listed in the apparatus conjectures. That is, wording that is not found in any manuscripts, but that scholars over the centuries thought may well represent the original wording. Now, they had 162 conjectures, I believe. Not a single one did they think had the original wording. Not one.
Mm-hmm.
Today, the Nestle Aland 28 has 2 conjectures in it that they think is the original. And yet one of them is not really a conjecture. It's found in versional witnesses at 2 Peter 3:10. I think they're wrong in both places. And so did Metzger on both places. He discussed these variants before. But the fact is that we have the text. I'm going to show you my Nestle Aland 28th edition. And so we have the text here. You can see this. It's either above the line or below the line. It's either in the text or in the apparatus, which gives the textual variants. We have the text on that page, whether it's above the line or below. There are places where we're not sure. But what's interesting is I don't think we need to resort to conjecture. And if we do, it's twice. Now, when you look at the age of manuscripts in the 20th century, the 20th century was considered the age of papyri when they started to get discovered. And we are still discovering them. We discover an average of 1 a year ever since way back when Hort had access to one, P1, but didn't use it, didn't know of its value at all. So there's about 130 New Testament papyri right now. Those are our oldest manuscripts for the most part.
Right.
And it's really amazing to find these. They were dug up out of Egypt decades ago, sometimes over a century ago. And they have a lot of, they've confirmed a lot of the wording that we think the original text had. Hort, in his famous text of the New Testament, of the original Greek New Testament, in his introduction and appendix, Westcott and Hort authored this, but Hort was really the main author of their method. And they had in their Greek New Testament a number of places in Luke and John, I believe, where Vaticanus Codex B was the only manuscript that they thought had the original wording, only one manuscript. And then when P75 was discovered in the 1950s, so long after they published their work in 1881, when P75 was discovered, it confirmed a number of these readings that only Vaticanus had. It's remarkable. And then P66 was discovered shortly before that. We found a bunch of other papyri that have confirmed a lot of these readings. So their instincts were very good. But here's the interesting thing. So these papyri, which have revolutionized our study of what the original New Testament must have said, there is not a single place where these papyri have the original wording that is not found in some other witness from the 4th or later centuries.
Wow.
Now let that sink in. We already knew what the original text was. It was either above the line or below the line from the manuscripts that came 300 years after the New Testament was written. And we already had that the papyri only confirmed a very important confirmation, but that's the role that they had, which means that the text wasn't wild in the first centuries. It was stable. The papyri show this.
Wow, that's amazing. One thing I just wanted to add with Oxyrhynchus, you may have heard this before, Dan, but people would say, well, he was a garbage dump, and they found these New Testament manuscripts in a garbage dump. Why would Christians throw this in a garbage dump? Can you maybe respond to that? Because you hear that a bit, usually from the majority text folks. Can you maybe comment towards that? This argument that it devalues the Alexandrian manuscripts because they were found in a trash heap.
Well, Anne-Marie Lyondike at Princeton Seminary has actually, she's been promoting this idea especially. She wrote an article about garbology. She came up with that term. And now she's not a majority text. She's not an evangelical. She's not even a moderate Christian, a liberal. But she makes a number of assumptions here, like these Christians were throwing these manuscripts away. Well, now, wait a minute. Oxyrhynchus covers a long period of time. And what happens when somebody has died in a house? Well, you move in, and what do you do with the things? If somebody else doesn't know what those things are, they'll put them in the garbage. And this kind of thing would have happened. There's a number of reasons why these manuscripts would have been found in a garbage dump. But what's interesting is we don't have any real clear evidence of Christian scribes or Jewish scribes ever destroying copies of scripture by burning them.
Right.
They buried them, and it may be that they buried them in a garbage dump because they were so worn out, as so many of these papyri are, or because they were in a jar and nobody knew what was there, so they just took the things in the house and threw it out. There's a number of reasons. I was talking to Michael Kruger, a great scholar from Reformed Theological Seminary, Charlotte, in North Carolina, and we were talking about this article by Anne-Marie Leyendyke, and she's a really nice lady. I haven't met her yet. I've heard her speak, but her thesis is just so filled with holes. And there's these assumptions. Now, what's interesting is the same majority text people will say that on Patmos, when you had some scholars in the early 20th century that were looking at the manuscripts on the island of Patmos at the monastery of St. John the Theologian. I've been there 4 times, and we've photographed a number of their manuscripts. It's a 900-year-old monastery. It's one of my favorite places on earth to visit. So they looked at these minuscule manuscripts, these second millennium manuscripts, and they said, although they seem to have come from this area, we don't seem to have any direct descendants of this manuscript as a copy from this one. And so what some of them have said is, this leads us to the unavoidable conclusion that they must have destroyed the original when they made the copy. Really? That's the conclusion you're going to come to? How about that when they made a copy, they did it from copying a written text, and then they passed on those copies elsewhere, and that written text may have been used for copies that went elsewhere. So why would you have that same original written archetype that has copies of it at the monastery if they're being copied to go elsewhere? So it just doesn't make any sense. And again, it's based on zero evidence that this is what Jewish or Christian scribes did. The Nag Hammadi codices were found next to a cemetery, even though they were aberrant and they're not Christian documents. The Gospel of Thomas is proto-Gnostic, and then you have all this other stuff that's, you know what it is. So it's not Christian by any means.
Right.
But even then, they buried these next to a cemetery. A number of the papyri were found in a cemetery. The Dead Sea Scrolls were put in jars and hidden in a cave. We have many examples of this. And to say that, they were just throwing them out, that is just, that's irresponsible to say those kinds of things.
Yeah, totally agree. So what would you say, Dan, in terms of the manuscripts? So all the New Testament manuscripts to date, so including Greek and Latin and Syriac and Sahidic and Coptic, how many would you say we have right now to date? Because I know you've been cataloging your Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. You guys have been cataloging and taking pictures of these ancient and medieval manuscripts. What would you say is a good round number for the number of manuscripts for the New Testament?
The Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany, is actually the official cataloger of Greek New Testament manuscripts, and they've been around since 1959 when Kurt Aland started it. And I spent my second sabbatical in Münster. Spent a lot of time there. I know the people well, and they came out with an official number a couple of years ago of actual Greek New Testament manuscripts that we still have that they're extant today. And they said the official number is 5,700. Now, we've found some since that time, but that's a good round number to keep in mind, 5,700 Greek New Testament manuscripts. The average size of those, even though the earliest ones are fragmentary, from the 2nd and 3rd century, 4th century, we start getting some, Codex Sinaiticus is the oldest complete complete New Testament manuscript by half a millennium. And then we get manuscripts that are very lengthy. Codex Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, Framia Rescriptus, 4th, 5th century. Others, Codex Bezae, the Gospels and Acts, and a number of other manuscripts. The average size manuscript, Greek manuscript, is over 400 pages long.
Wow.
That's a lot of material.
A lot.
And some people like to talk about, well, okay, 5,700 manuscripts and the average size is that big, but how many manuscripts do we really have in the first millennium up to AD 1000? And here's the interesting thing. They switch to talk about percentages instead of talking about the number. They'll talk about, well, we have 15%, something like that. The actual number that I counted long before the official number from Munster came out of 5,700 was before the year 1000, we have at least 961 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Okay, if that's 15%, that's still a large chunk of manuscripts. And not only do we have the Greek New Testament manuscripts, hundreds, thousands of them, but we also have the New Testament translated into Latin from, as I said, the late 2nd century on. And that Latin became the lingua franca for Western Europe after Constantine moved the capital to Byzantium or Constantinople in the 4th century. And we have nearly twice as many manuscripts in Latin as we do in Greek. We really have no idea how many we have, but we think the number is somewhere between 8 and 10,000. It may be much higher than that, but let's just call it 10,000. And again, the average size is going to be at least 400 pages, if not much more, because we're not dealing with manuscripts from the early centuries nearly as much as we would Greek, because that's the original.
Yeah.
And so the later you go, the more we get preserved, because you start getting parchment manuscripts. We have one or two in the 3rd century, then 4th century, that became kind of the standard, even though we still have a bunch of papyri.
Yeah.
So we've got well over 400 pages on average of those. And then you have Coptic and Syriac 3rd century translations that are extraordinarily important. And we have hundreds of those, perhaps thousands of Syriac. We have Old Church Slavonic, we have Armenian, we have Georgian, we have Gothic, we have just so many different languages, so many different ancient versions before the time of the printing press, that my best guess is that we have at least 15 to 20,000, not counting the Greek New Testament manuscripts.
Wow. Amazing. So
altogether, and again, the average size would be well over 400 pages long. The average size of these between 15 and 20,000, so 20 to 25,000 with the Greek. If you were to look at the extant copies of the average classical Greek or Latin author, there would be about, I'm speaking pretty generously here for the average, about 15 copies.
Yeah.
And frequently, if not usually, you can trace those copies back to 2 archetypes at a certain, like 12th century, and then they go in different paths from there. But you can see the direct copies of one from the other. In fact, so many of these copies, you can say, I know this was an exact copy of this one and this one and this one. You can't say that with the New Testament manuscripts, except for maybe a dozen, 15 copies where we know this is an exact copy of that one, which tells us there were so many intermediary copies that we don't have. We have so many manuscripts of the New Testament that have been lost to history. First, because of the Diocletian persecution, of course, in the early 4th century. Yeah. And then all sorts of reasons, but persecutions are a major reason why we don't have as many as we could have. But we have far more of that than any other ancient literature. Homer stands in 2nd place by a long shot, far more than any other ancient Greco-Roman literature. About 2,000 manuscripts of Homer's writings. Most of them are fragmentary papyri that come many, many centuries after he wrote. Now, you take that average, say 15 manuscripts, you were to stack them up, it would be about 3.5, maybe 4 feet tall. So if I'm speaking at a church, and I've used this illustration when I've spoken at churches and conferences, stack them up, be about the height of a podium. If you were to stack those New Testament manuscripts up, the 20 to 25,000, it would be more than 4 Empire State Buildings stacked one on top of the other.
Wow.
Over a mile high.
Right.
4 feet, mile high.
Yeah.
And yet you get skeptics to say, well, we can't possibly tell what the original New Testament said because we're waiting decades before we get our copies. And, and okay, now I should mention that the average for these classical authors, the average earliest copies are about 500 to 1,000 years later. And you take Pindar's poems, the first substantial copies come about 1,800 years after Pindar wrote.
Yeah.
Well, if that were the case with the New Testament, we'd say the earliest substantial copies are about the time the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Really? That's when skeptics would have something to complain about.
Of course.
But to say the New Testament is in bad shape, when you compare it to anything from the Greco-Roman world, you're just talking out your rear end. To put it politely.
100%.
We have over 1,000 times more manuscript evidence for the New Testament than we do the average classical author. There's no comparison.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. Dan, I just had a couple more questions. This is more of an exegetical question. A lot of Muslims and those in aberrant movements usually cite your work on John 1:1 to argue that the word or the logos is not truly God. And can you comment on that? I know you've got an excellent section in your book on that question. Can you comment on John 1:1c and exactly what Kai Theos Hein Hologos is actually saying about the word? Jehovah's Witnesses, their New World Translation they have, and the word was a God. And if you can just address that. And I was also interested in what you think about Moffat and Goodspeed's. Their translation says the word was divine, or the logos was divine. So I was just interested in the exegetical question, and maybe if you can comment a bit on Moffat and Goodspeed.
Yeah, let me start with 1933. This is when Ernest Codman Caldwell, who was actually my Greek professor's professor in college, Harry Sturz, who was a texture critic, and Caldwell was one of the great American texture critics of the mid-20th century. Caldwell was at Claremont College at the time out in California. 2 years after he got his doctorate done in 1931, Caldwell wrote an article for the Journal of Biblical Literature in volume 51. I think it's pages 12 through 21. And that article is called A Definite Rule for the article, I think, something like that, of the Greek New Testament. And what Caldwell did was he looked at a number of passages, and the key text to him at first, I'm going to pull this up in my, I'll just, I was going to look at it online, but I'll just grab my Greek text. I think it's John 1:46 is the text. You'll have to forgive me. I need reading glasses, and this is my small Nestle text.
No problem.
So you may have to help me read what it says, but John 1:46, I think is where he sees this. And Nathanael said to him, let's see, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And Philip says, come and see. And then you see, let's see, it's John 1:48. No, John 1:49. Okay. So Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Now, in John 1:49, the Greek has su I ha huios tutheu. That is, you are, and then the Son of the God. We don't translate God before God there.
Right.
But then the second clause, which is a parallel to that, you are the Son of God, you're the King of Israel. It has su basileus, you King are of Israel. So you have basileus, king, coming before the verb
Right.
and without the article. And Caldwell looked at that. He had done his doctoral dissertation on the character of the Greek of the fourth gospel in 1941. So this was fresh on his mind. And he looked at that and said, these two are parallel, and yet the word order is not parallel. In the second clause, the predicate nominative comes before the verb, and it lacks the article, but it's every bit as definite as the first clause. And so you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel.
Right.
He was right in that instance, but not because it comes before the verb. There's another feature to it, and that is the of Israel. I won't get into the issues here too much, but what Caldwell did was he looked at all the places that he thought the Greek had a definite predicate nominative. And I suspect the way he did this is by looking at an English translation. And then he looked at the Greek. I don't know what his actual method was, but this makes sense. And then he looked at the Greek, and he found that in a number of the cases that you had the predicate nominative with the article after the verb or without the article before the verb. And so he said, he made this rule that definite predicate nominatives that are before the verb are usually anarthrous. Now, that's the statement of his rule.
Right.
But the converse of the rule is what scholars since 1933 have claimed. That is, that anarthrous, that is without the article, predicate nominatives before the verb are usually definite. And that's a fallacy. Caldwell even claimed that a little bit in his article. And he told my professor, Harry Sturz, before Caldwell died, that he believed that the converse of his rule was every bit as legitimate as the rule was. Now, here's the fallacy. I'll put it in very simple terms. Let's say a child's looking out the window of his home, and he only looks outside whenever it's raining. He says, oh, that's interesting. Let me see what that is. Looks outside, sees the rain. Looks up, sees clouds. So he formulates a principle. Every time it's raining, there are clouds in the sky. Good principle. What about the converse? Every time there are clouds in the sky, it's raining. Bad principle. Doesn't flow from the first. The problem with Caldwell is he did not look at all anarthrous preverbal predicate nominatives. Had he done so, he would have come to a different conclusion. And so, 40 years later, in the same Journal of Biblical Literature, a guy named Philip Harner looked at the construction once again, and he found that I think it was more than John's gospel. He found this construction in the New Testament, and he said 80% of the time, he looked at the construction of all pre-verbal, non-articular or anarthrous predicate nominatives in the New Testament. And he said, what do they mean? He said 80% of the time they're qualitative, not definite. And then he went on to say that 20% of the time that they're definite for some reason other than the fact that it's before the verb. It's because it has a genitive modifier, or it's a monadic noun that is one of a kind, or it's a proper name or something like that, And Caldwell didn't take any of those things into consideration. Now, after 1933, scholars jumped on the Caldwell bandwagon, and they assumed he proved the converse. And so even Bruce Metzger, the great Bruce Metzger, said, this should give us the strongest argument that the translation, the word was a God by the Jehovah's Witnesses, has no basis at all. Actually, Caldwell didn't even address that issue. He was just looking at things that he already predetermined by context or by translation were definite. Now, Caldwell also didn't really speak about qualitative nouns, just in passing. What is a qualitative noun? Well, qualitative is between definite and indefinite, and it's a little tricky to define. You can have it as qualitative close to definite or qualitative close to indefinite, or with certain kinds of things, it's just straight qualitative, dealing with essence.
Right.
You have, going back to the early part of John 1, you have John 1:1c. And I would translate this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was divine. Although I don't agree with what Moffat and Goodspeed were trying to do with this. What I mean by divine is that this is a quality that the Word shared with God. He shared the same essence, nature as God the Father, but he was not the same person.
Right.
Now, I think John is giving us a clue that this is exactly what he's doing, because he starts out by saying, in the beginning, the Word was, and the Word was, and the Word was. And then in John 1:14, and the Word became flesh.
Right.
And there became, agenita is the verb, and sarx, the predicate nominative, is before the verb.
Right.
He doesn't mean, and the Word became the flesh, or the Word became a flesh. The Word took on humanity in essence.
Right.
He became 100% human, as the Nicene Creed 1700 years ago this year declared. He was 100% divine and 100% human. And so John's giving us this clue. Now, there are a number of evangelicals who say translating divine, no, that's not right. If they mean by that what Goodspeed or what Moffat are saying, I agree with that fully. I actually prefer the translation of the New English Bible, Revised English Bible, that really captures it the best. What God was, the Word was.
Right. Right.
It's focusing on the what.
Right.
And
William Barclay actually liked that as well. Barclay also liked that translation.
Yeah. And we would have used that in the Net Bible, except they already had it. So I think we had something a little. Let me see what we did in the Net Bible, but I thought it was pretty good what we had. So we've got. This is what we. Oh, I'm sorry. That's First John. Never mind.
Actually picked up a copy at the ETS in Boston of the NET.
Was that right?
Yeah.
Oh,
which you also had a hand in, right, Dan? You also
I was the senior New Testament editor for it.
Right.
Here's what it says: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was fully God.
Yes,
I like that.
Yeah,
we've added a word to emphasize essence, but what John is doing is, this is the most concise way he could possibly say that the second person of the Trinity and the first person of the Trinity are both God, but they are not the same person.
Right.
He could not say it in any fewer words. It's not the most precise way he could say it, but it is the most concise way he could say it.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the New World Translation, you've got something like a dozen times in the first 18 verses of John, 7, 8 times, I don't recall the number, but they say it's because it lacks the article, therefore it's a God. They don't do that any other time.
That's right.
With us in this same prologue.
Right.
In fact, it's just ridiculously disingenuous. So,
yeah, like John 1:6 says that there was a man sent by Theos. So the word Theos is an arthrus, and they don't translate it. There was a man sent by a God.
Yeah, so, right. Yeah. No, Jesus didn't send John the Baptist.
Right.
So, okay. Now, what's interesting is I looked at scholarship before 1933. And Westcott, in his great commentary on John's Gospel, said, this is not the same thing as saying the Word was the God, which would be Sabellianism. That is, the Father is the Son is the Spirit. It's all the same, or modalism. But I looked at Luther, I looked at Origen, his comment on this passage. All of them understood that it's qualitative, and they explained it that way. After 1933, we mixed it up. And so even Nigel Turner, who wrote a Greek grammar in the Moulton Howard Turner series, he did his grammar in 1933 that J.H. Moulton started in 1906. He said that the statement, I'll just have to read the Greek because that's how he speaks about it. He says, Theos ein ha logos is the same thing as saying ha logos ein theos. Ein ha theos. Ha logos ein ha theos. I'm sorry. So he's saying either way, it's saying the same thing. No, it's not. And this is what Jehovah's Witnesses have camped on, and rightfully so, where they've said, if you say the word is with God, then how can he be God?
Right.
Well, if you mean by that the Father, he can't. But John isn't saying he's the Father. He's saying he has exactly the same essence as the Father.
Right.
In fact, John 1:18 is really fascinating.
Yeah.
How it's worded here, because you have the direct object, theon, thrown forward. It's not a predicate nominative, but the Jehovah's Witnesses say no one has seen God at any time.
Right.
But it's an arthrus without the
Right.
article.
Right.
We don't translate this, no one has seen a God at any
Right.
time. Nobody would do that. They wouldn't do that. But
Right.
it's not God in his, I think the focus of it being anarthrus and thrown forward is to say no one has seen God in his essence at any time. The unique one, himself God, has explained him, has shown him to us. He's exegeted him. Yeah.
Right. Right. That's very good. Yeah. Yeah.
For Muslims to claim that I hold to anything less than the absolute full deity of Christ is that's such a perverted reading of what I've had to say, because I explain it in great detail and they just want to pull snippets. That tells you don't trust what they're saying about Christian theology.
Yeah. Right. Right. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses did the same with Julius Armanti and with other translators as well. So it's not surprising that they would take snippets of your work and make you say something you never did. Yeah.
Right.
So Dan, I just wanted to also talk a little bit about, because of course the longer ending of Mark 16:9-20, and the comma, the pericope adulterae in John 7:53 to John 8:11. I remember you once saying that it's your favorite part in the Bible that's not in the Bible.
Yes, my favorite passage that's not in the Bible is what I say about the story of the woman caught in adultery. Yeah.
So can you maybe just touch on that a bit? Because I mean, there's been a lot of ink spilled over this, and the idea again is that they've taken the ending of Mark, and Mark doesn't have a resurrection. Of course he does. You shall see it before you to Galilee. And can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because there are still Christians today wondering why, they will cast out demons. They'll take up serpents in their hands. Why that's not part of Mark's gospel.
Right.
And the adultery, pericope adultery. Yeah.
We may not have time to deal with the pericope adultery. But I do want to spend some time on Mark 16. Actually, what I will say is this in general. These are the only two passages that are in dispute that are more than 2 verses long. And they're 12 verses long each. That's very significant. We have, after this, about 15 places where it's 1 or 2 verses that are in dispute. And then everything else is part of a verse or small part of a word or something, a letter difference, those kinds of things. So you read some who say, well, here's a couple of examples of the kinds of texture variants we have. That's disingenuous. That's not true. These are not a couple of examples. These are the extreme examples that have a lot of emotional baggage with them, especially the story of the woman caught in adultery.
Yeah.
I'll just mention this about the woman caught in adultery. You actually have far greater evidence against its authenticity than you do against the authenticity of the last 12 verses of Mark. And yet, the evidence against the last 12 verses of Mark is so solid that only majority text and Textus Receptus people think it's original. It's reasoned eclectics, those who stand within the mainstream of textual criticism, really would say, no, this is not authentic. Even Erasmus had questions about it in his annotations of his Greek New Testament. Okay, so what I'm saying is, whatever I say about Mark 16 applies even more to the story of the woman caught in adultery. So, because you have, for example, you only have 2 Greek manuscripts that lack those 12 verses in Mark. But you have 20% of all of our manuscripts, and only one before the 8th century that, I'm sorry, all of them except one before the 8th century lack the story of the woman caught in adultery. You don't have any commentator who writes on this until the 12th century. The language is not John's. It actually fits Luke's language far better than John. It's a floating text. It's in 5 different locations, 3 in John. It comes between Luke and John. It comes after John's gospel. It's a passage that's trying to find a home, and it kind of bumps around until it can finally land after John 7:52. There are here I said I'm not going to talk about the story of the woman caught in adultery, but here I am talking about it. Doesn't fit John's style. It disrupts the narrative. It's not found in the Eusebian canons, which Eusebius in the early 4th century put together to show what lections were to be read at different times, daily or weekly Christian readings of Scripture. Nor is the ending of Mark's gospel found in the Eusebian canons. It was a way to find out where you were in the Gospels and to read. It was kind of the precursor to cross-referencing in the Gospels that we have today. Brilliant system that Eusebius came up with.
Wow.
Okay, so what's interesting is I had, again, I keep saying I'm only going to touch on John 8, but one of my students wrote a paper that got published in Novum Testamentum. His name is Kyle Hughes, and it was on the Lucan source for the story of the woman caught in adultery. Several decades ago, Bart Ehrman published an article in New Testament Studies, the premier New Testament scholarly journal, and Novum Testamentum is right up there with it, where he said that the actual story that we have of the story of the woman caught in adultery seems to have been a conflated story between the East and the West, done in about the 3rd century from some new evidence that had been discovered. So I looked at this, and what's interesting is one of the places where the story of the woman caught in adultery is found in a complete family is after Luke 21:38. In the Passion narrative during the last week of Jesus before the cross. And Kyle Hughes looked at the statement in John, and he found that there are traces of Lucanisms, that there are things here that look like it's a source that Luke used, but not at all like what John had or John's writing. There's only one phrase that anybody's been able to find that even looks like John, and yet everything else looks like Luke or something other than that. One of the earliest sources for the story of the woman caught in adultery is not really exactly the same story. It's by Papias. He's an early 2nd century writer who may have been a direct disciple of John the Apostle, or if not direct, 2nd generation. And Papias writes about what Mark wrote, what Matthew wrote, and what John wrote. And when he speaks about this story, it's not exactly the same. You don't have a woman caught in adultery. She's caught in some sin, if I recall. You don't have the Pharisees peeling off from the older to the younger after Jesus said, the one who has no sin cast the first stone, let him cast the first stone. So it's not exactly the same. It's what was combined with a later story to make what we find in John's gospel. Papias, though, who knew John well, he knew John better than any of the other apostles, says this is in the gospel to the Hebrews. If there's one thing we can say about John's gospel, it's not to the Hebrews. It's not John's gospel. That was another document that we knew of in the ancient world, but we don't have it anymore, but it's not the gospel of John. So how is it that Papias, who knew John well and had a form of this story, doesn't attribute it to John? How can that be? Is he that mistaken? Or is it that this really was a story that came from some other source? And I think that a form of it Luke actually had. And because it was not as colorful as some of the other stories, and because he had limitations of space because it was written on a papyrus scroll, and you could only have so much material in those, this Luke's gospel would have been 28 feet long on a normal sized papyrus scroll. And the longest you can have of any usable space really on a scroll would be 35 feet, and hardly any books were that long. So So he has to cut a number of things out. So it didn't have those really unusual features about, that look almost apocryphal.
Right.
But what it did have, and what I would say, the story is not canonical, it's not scripture, but is it historical? And I think that there are certainly elements of it that are historical.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly what, I don't know. But one thing I'm pretty sure of, and that is that when it says that Jesus bent down and wrote something in the dirt,
Mm-hmm.
that really happened.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I would argue that, this gets all the way back to how textual criticism is done, is one of the principal things that scribes did was they clarified what they thought the text meant. And that's a major kind of a textual variant. For example, in Mark's Gospel, chapter 6 through 8,
Mm-hmm.
there's 89 verses in a row in which Mark does not mention the name of Jesus or his title. The only way he's referred to is with pronouns for 89 verses in a row.
Wow.
But later manuscripts and lectionaries insert the name Jesus or the Lord 4 times to make sure we see who it is. So these scribes wanted to get clarity. By the time you get to Jesus healing the blind man by spitting in his face, that's when you get Jesus introduced after 2 chapters, 6, 7, and 8. Finally, he gets to it,
Right.
So this is a scribal tendency, is to clarify. Okay, so what do we have with Jesus writing in the dirt? We don't know what he wrote, but the scribes do. They came up with a dozen different things of what he must have written. It could be their sins, the 10 Commandments, all sorts of things he wrote down. So where it came from, I don't know, but I suspect that a part of it, I don't know exactly what part, is actually true history.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I would not preach on it in
Right.
church.
Right.
Because the Bible is both a divine product and a human product. And if John wrote the gospel, or whoever wrote the gospel, but I think it was John the Apostle, I don't think he would appreciate somebody inserting these 12 verses where he was marching with a particular cadence with his story, and it interrupted. Same as Mark. So let me get on to what's going on with Mark. All right. So was that enough to at least give some?
Perfect.
Okay. So Mark 16, 9 through 20. Our 2 oldest manuscripts for that passage are Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both 4th century, both originally complete Bibles in Greek. Sinaiticus, discovered in 1859 by Constantine Tischendorf, it's the oldest complete New Testament. The next oldest is from the 9th century. And it's a fascinating story how it ended up. He's a German evangelical scholar who did his work for the Tsar of Russia, and it ended up after the Bolshevik Revolution at the British Museum, which is now at the British Library. I've seen it every time I go to London.
I just saw it, Dan, a couple of months ago. I was in London.
Was that right?
Got to see it. It was a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah. It's terrific. Yeah. So anyway, so those 2 manuscripts don't have it. Vaticanus has a gap. Vaticanus is our only 3-column manuscript of the Bible in the first millennium.
Mm-hmm.
Sinaiticus, the only 4-column New Testament manuscript in the first of any of our Greek manuscripts. Emperor Constantine, when he asked Eusebius to make 50 Bibles for the capital city, he said, make them in 3s and 4s. We don't know what that means, but one possibility that's been floated is that he meant make them in 3 and 4 columns.
Mm-hmm.
That actually makes a lot of sense, because these are meant to be read publicly. And as you well know, if you read a Bible that is just 1 column across, it's easy to lose your space, your place in line. And so our lectionaries, the manuscripts that were to be read publicly, are almost always 2 columns so that you wouldn't lose your place. And Sinaiticus, a very, very large codex, was 4 columns, and Vaticanus 3, the only ones from the first millennium. So they may well have been 2 of those original 50. Anyway, I won't get into the details of that, but what you have is if you ended at verse 8, then it says that the angel tells the women to go tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. And the women were terrified. They did nothing, for they were afraid. End of story. So it ends with ephabuntagar, afraid for. Afraid they were for, with a conjunction at the end. Now, in terms of the external evidence, Aleph and B, or Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, are by far our two best New Testament manuscripts. But what's interesting is there are a few manuscripts that have an intermediate ending before this long ending, or just with the intermediate ending itself. And let me read to you what it says. This is out of our oldest Latin manuscript, Codex Bobiensis, which is 4th or 5th century. And it ends right after this intermediate ending. After verse 8, it says, "But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after these things, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation." Yeah, that's pretty vanilla. That's not a real exciting kind of a thing. And yet, that's what we have in a number of manuscripts, not very many, that just have that, or they have the long ending after it. There's not a single manuscript that has a long ending first and then the intermediate ending, except one where the guy draws an arrow to say, oops, I forgot to put this in first. Bruce Metzger comments on this, and he says, "No one who had available as the conclusion of the second gospel, the 12 verses 9 through 20, so rich in interesting material, would have deliberately replaced them with a few lines of a colorless and generalized summary." That's brilliant. So how do you explain that intermediate ending and the manuscripts that have the intermediate ending and then the long ending? Well, it came from sources that had just the intermediate ending, and scribes tended to put things in instead of take things out. So if they saw two manuscripts that had different stories, they often would conflate them or put them one after the other. This is a typical thing that scribes did.
Right.
So usually it's a much smaller portion of text, but this is some strong evidence that this is what they did here. You also have ancient versions, like you have our earliest Coptic manuscripts, and you've got some others that don't have the long ending, or they have the intermediate ending and then the long ending. And Armenian, it's a language that was not one of the earliest ones, but it was translated directly from ancient Greek manuscripts. And then Georgian was translated from the Armenian. Caldwell, man, I've mentioned already a couple times on this show, looked at some research that had been done on the Armenian Gospels manuscripts. There were, I think, something like 225 of them. And what he discovered was that, for the most part, the oldest ones and the best ones lacked anything after verse 8. In fact, it was 99 of those manuscripts that had nothing after verse 8. That's a lot of manuscripts. And what happens with the versions is they're translations of an earlier Greek, where there's inertia that sets in. Once you translate from the Greek and Hebrew into another language, the inertia sets in where you're not going to have some later translator go back and look at the Greek and Hebrew and change that very often. Famously, Jerome did that because of the Latin manuscripts that were all over the place. And by the late 4th century, he gets all these Latin manuscripts, compares them with the Greek, and does the Vulgate. But that shows that that's an unusual thing, and we even know who did it. But you get these manuscripts where you get it translated into a version, and it solidifies in time what the Greek text behind it must have looked like. I think that's a very interesting thing. 99 of these Armenian manuscripts didn't have it. Now, there are some manuscripts where they do have verses 9 through 20, but in the margin, it says at the margin of verse 8, Eusebius canonized the text to here. But some manuscripts have the following. Then they have verses 9 through 20. So even those manuscripts that have verses 9 through 20 don't always mean that that's what the original had, because they mentioned Eusebius canonized it, the Eusebian canons to verse 8, but nothing past that. So you've got the intermediate ending. You've got these ancient versions, especially Armenian, but some of the others. You've got our oldest and best and most important Greek New Testament manuscripts that lack it. You've got a lot of external evidence, but now when you look at the church fathers, here's an interesting phenomenon. Eusebius, in the early 4th century, with Origen's library in Caesarea that he got, Origen, the great scholar who did the hexapla on the Old Testament from Alexandria, he's got his library, and Emperor Constantine is asking him to make 50 Bibles for the capital city. So Eusebius makes a comment about Mark 16, and he says, the vast majority of manuscripts that I've looked at end the gospel at "for they were afraid," but few add the following 12 verses. So in the early 4th century, when he's got the wealth of the emperor behind him to look at Greek manuscripts and other versions, I presume, he's saying, I can hardly find this in any manuscripts. So it's not just Aleph and B. It's what he's saying is what's lacking. Then towards the end of the 4th century, when Jerome is still working on the New Testament, he says, now Jerome has the Pope behind him, so the Latin manuscripts. And he makes an additional comment. He says what Eusebius says, but he adds another point. He says that I find this longer ending only in a few manuscripts and hardly ever in the Greek. So that to me sounds like maybe he knew of some Latin manuscripts that had it, but the Greek hardly ever. In fact, the way he words this, Jerome actually talks about some material that's between verses 14 and 15 in the long ending that we only knew about. It was a long text. It would have been about 4 verses if we had it translated as part of our Bibles. And we knew of no manuscripts that had this material. I won't read it. It goes on for a long, long time. But Jerome says the way he's wording it, it's as if he found that in more manuscripts than he did the long ending. One manuscript finally was discovered that had that, and that was in 1906, Codex Washingtonianus, late 4th, early 5th century Gospels manuscript at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And it has it's the Freer Logion, named after Charles Freer, the man who purchased the manuscripts in Egypt. A bunch of manuscripts, but that's the only, apart from Jerome's statement, that's the only manuscript we have that has that. And yet Jerome sounds as if he's saying, I found more that have this than the long ending.
Wow.
Early, late 4th century, the wealth of the empire or the emperor behind him, the wealth of the Pope behind him, Greek and Latin manuscripts, and the short ending is considered the original. Now, we have one commentary and only one of the Gospel of Mark, the whole Gospel of Mark, in the 1st millennium. That was done by Victor of Antioch in the late 5th or early 6th century. And he comments about this passage. And he says, I've seen a number of manuscripts that have the long ending and a number of manuscripts that stop it at verse 8. I think the better manuscripts have the long ending. That commentary probably was reflecting how the change had started to happen in the 5th century, and that it continued on after that. And perhaps because of his commentary, that's why manuscripts had it, because the scribes often would put things in that they found a commentator talks about, so they put that in their text. Okay, so all that together, now you've got that's external evidence that you look at. When you look at the internal evidence, there are 3 arguments against. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one other piece of external evidence. It's really fascinating to me. I think the long ending of Mark was probably added to the gospel in some region in the 120s or 130s, very early on. but it didn't really take off in a wide way until the late 4th, early 5th century, probably, since we have no manuscripts prior to the 5th century that have it. Okay. I looked at some church fathers, and from the 2nd to 5th century, we have no fewer than 10 church fathers who quote from the long ending. But what's interesting, and they quote from it positively, they don't have any problems, no qualms with it.
Right.
They are quoting specifically from verses 15 to 20 that talks about picking up snakes, drinking poison, speaking in tongues. The first verses 9 through 14 that talk about resurrection appearance, they don't quote from.
Wow.
This actually led one German scholar to say verses 9 through 14 may have been added later, and it starts at verse 15. So here's the interesting thing. The argument against the short ending that many scholars have, especially majority text and King James only type folks, have said is that, well, the short ending, these Alexandrians would not like that long ending because of the picking up of snakes and the drinking poison and all the rest, the supernatural weird stuff. They're against it. Really? Church fathers, not a single church father between the 2nd and 5th century said anything against those verses. The first one to make a comment, let's see, the quotes from the verses 9 through 14 is from the 4th century. That's the first one that I know of.
Yeah.
There may be others. James Snap has found, he spent his life looking at these early church fathers, and and maybe they're alluding to this portion of that, and he may well have discovered stuff, but that doesn't say anything. I mean, none of these church fathers comes before when I think it was added in the 120s or 30s.
Right. Because Irenaeus, I think, alludes to it too. He mentions it as well.
Who's that?
Does Irenaeus mention the longer ending as well? Bishop of Lyon.
No. Oh, yes, he does.
Irenaeus.
He quotes from verses 17 and 18, and it might be Justin Martyr who does this. That could, and I'm not opposed to that. I think in verse 20 he may be quoting from. So it's known to some of these, but still, even by Eusebius and Jerome, it's in a small minority of manuscripts that have it.
Right.
Okay, now that's the external evidence, but textual criticism is not just looking at the stuff that's out there, the manuscripts and the versions and the quotations by the church fathers. It's not just the physical material that we can see and feel with our hands. It's also internal evidence. And this is something I held to a view that was pretty close to the majority text for 17 years. And I kept coming across problems, textual variants that I simply could not explain. I said, well, it's found in the majority of manuscripts, and especially in the Byzantine, so therefore it must be original. But when I looked at the fundamental principle of textual criticism of choose the reading that best explains the rise of the others, I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain how this came from that. Okay, now, when it comes to the other argument, that would scribes be likely to add something? Absolutely they would, because at 16:8, there is no resurrection appearance by Jesus to any of the disciples.
Right.
In verses 9 and following, now you have him appear to the women. So there's a strong impulse. It would be the only gospel without an appearance by Jesus to the women. So that's strong internal evidence as to why something would be added and why at least two somethings were added.
Right.
So, the intermediate and the longer ending, and then the intermediate plus the longer, and then the longer plus the freer log. I mean, it's just so many different ways.
They seem to be conflating Matthew and Luke and John. You've got, portions. You've got the ascension in verse 20, taken from Luke, the book of Acts, and the end of Luke also.
Yeah, the book of Acts, right. It's just picking up all this early Christian stuff.
Yeah. And even the one about the snakes and drinking poison. I mean, you've got some of that in the book of Acts, I think, with Paul. I mean, I think that I remember doing a debate years ago with a majority text fellow, and they bring up this whole thing about, well, Mark doesn't have a resurrection account. Well, the tomb is empty, and and
the angel says he's been raised from the dead.
Yeah, and says he goes before you, and you will see him in Galilee. So I mean, it's there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But just talking about a little bit, and I know we're almost at the 2-hour mark, Dan. I don't want to hold you up too long.
Well, actually, I do want to talk about the internal evidence, so I'm happy to keep
please,
going.
please go ahead.
But you had a question. I'm sorry.
No, well, it's more towards the critical versus the majority text. But if you want to talk about the internal evidence a little more, that's
Well, the majority text looks at the external evidence. The majority of manuscripts, that tells you what the original is. But reasoned eclecticism, which is what the great majority of textual scholars hold to, has a balanced view between the internal evidence and the external. And internal evidence has to do with it. There's two branches, and I'm just weaving this right into the Mark 16 situation. One is transcriptional probability, and that has to do with what is a scribe likely to have done to the text. In those 89 verses in Mark 6 through 8, is a scribe likely to have taken out the name Jesus or the name Lord 4 times, or to put it in because he's only referred to by pronouns? Which is more likely? Scribes didn't make things more vague. That was not their tendency.
Right.
And transcriptional probability, we actually know very clearly about certain kinds of scribal errors. Intentional and unintentional. Intentional, they clarified, sometimes very rarely, but sometimes they tried to make a theological point that might be a little over the top, but it was nothing that was not implicit already. And so when I've debated Bart, I've pointed out, this is a side note, but a very important side note. In his misquoting Jesus in the paperback edition, on page 252 in the appendix, besides the quote I gave you about what he said about Metzger and him being locked in a room, the editors asked him, why do you disagree with your mentor about core doctrines being in jeopardy because of the textual variants? And that's the way they had read this 250-page book, cover to cover. That's what they thought he was saying. When they point blank asked him that question, it's only in the paperback version, he said, I don't actually disagree with Metzger. Textual variants or essential doctrines are not in jeopardy because of the textual variants in the New Testament.
Right.
He should have said that more clearly all the way through. There's hundreds of thousands of college kids that have abandoned the church because of what they thought he said and what he did not even try to clarify.
Right.
Okay. So internal evidence has to do with transcriptional probability, intentional and unintentional. There's all sorts of mistakes that scribes make. But it also has to do with intrinsic probability. What is an author likely to have written? And this actually has to do with our goal should be to try to recover the original wording. Because if that's not our goal, then we're cutting out what an author is likely to have written. And that's always been what we do with the New Testament. Interpretation for 2,000 years has assumed we know what the author wrote. And there's some schools are saying we can't possibly tell what the original text said anymore. They're just cutting out the author. They've just cut out 1/4 of all of textual criticism right there. And the last time I talked to Bart, he said, that's wrong to cut that out. So maybe he's changing his views. I don't know. Anyway, okay. So as I look at this, you say, well, some people say, evangelicals especially will say this, well, the external evidence, that's hard evidence. Yeah, but it's always imperfect copies of the perfect Word of God. Internal evidence is subjective. Yes, but copies are imperfect. So it's subjective, but it's not all equally subjective, just like all copies are not equally imperfect. Right. There's ways we can tell which ones are the better manuscripts. There's ways we can tell which internal evidence is more probable. And generally speaking, the longer a passage is, the stronger arguments from intrinsic probability become what an author is likely to have written. So here's one of the intrinsic arguments I would use. There's not a single passage of equal length or close to equal length in Mark's gospel that has nearly the anomalies in syntax, in forms, in theological points or leitmotifs or wording or style of Greek as these 12 verses in Mark. Not a single passage comes close to that.
Wow.
And that, coupled with the fact that it's in dispute in all of our witnesses, tells us, I'm not so sure I want to take this as original. Okay, that's one piece of evidence. But when I look at Mark's gospel, I think he's actually giving us a clue that he's going to end it this way. Mark's gospel, I hold to Mark in priority. And my good friend, Will Varner, has just published a commentary on Matthew where he doesn't hold to Mark in priority. And I commented on his Facebook post about that. He's a good scholar, a good friend. But someone said that he doesn't know of a single scholar under 40 years old who holds to Mark in priority. And I'm just shocked at that, because I think that's really some solid scholarly evidence for that. Not that you have to hold to it, but I think the evidence internally and externally is very, very powerful for it. So on that assumption, here's some clues that I see in Mark. Between Matthew and Mark, there's 600 verses of Mark's 660 that are shared between the two gospels, with some wording differences, but essentially 90% of the verses in Mark are found in Matthew, with some tweaking. But when it comes to Christology, in terms of the knowledge of the Son, in terms of his power, his omniscience, his how he disciples, all sorts of things, Matthew's gospel modifies what Mark has to say in a number of ways to make it more of what I'd call a pedagogical gospel. Matthew is explaining to people what they should believe about the Messiah. Mark's, I would call it a dialogical gospel. Mark is actually engaging his readers to think about what they believe while they're facing persecution. And as you well know, when you're in a combative situation, you better know what you believe and why you believe it. You have to come up with reasons. That's why, just to give a couple of examples, in Mark chapter 1, you have the baptism of Jesus by John, and there's 6 parallels between those that John baptizes and then baptizing Jesus. It comes from a certain place, comes to the Jordan River, John does the baptism, all the rest of this. And there's one parallel that's missing with Jesus: for the forgiveness of sins. Mark just leaves that off with Jesus. Matthew doesn't do that. He actually makes an explicit, he does, but he has a conversation between John and Jesus where we see, okay, well, I should be baptized, but okay, that tells us Jesus is not a sinner. Mark leaves that for you to work out for yourself. Or the rich young ruler. In Mark's gospel, you have the rich young ruler saying to Jesus, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? Only one is good. But here's what you have to do." And he lays it out. In Matthew, he says, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to gain eternal life?" And Jesus answers, "Why do you ask me about the good? Only one is good." Well, Mark's gospel is getting the readers to wrestle with, what do you really believe about Jesus? If you're going to call him good, are you prepared to say that he's God in the flesh? Because that's what you better say. Because that's what you better believe. But he wants them to own this. And so he leaves it up to the reader to come to these conclusions. In fact, as it was Ernest Best who commented on his book on the Mark as story, that Mark tends not to give us the answers where it was already known. And he talks about the ending of Mark's gospel. it's already known that these women went and told the disciples that Jesus is coming to meet them. It's already known that they shared the resurrection story with others and all the rest, but Mark doesn't have to tell us that. Okay, so those are some of the interesting things I'm looking at here. Then I read Mark 1:1, and in the ancient world, the first line of a book was very often treated as the title for that book. Not always, but a lot was. Mark 1:1 starts out with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The beginning of the gospel? Well, that might describe the first half of his gospel, or maybe it's describing the whole gospel. And you say, well, isn't that a stretch? Not really. Because Luke, in Acts 1:1, referring to his first book, because it was a 2-volume set that I'm sure he sent out at the same time. You couldn't put them between 2 covers because the scroll wasn't long enough to contain both Luke and Acts, so that's why it was 2 separate volumes, but sent both to Theophilus, I think in 62, as part of the trial brief that Theophilus was preparing to get Paul out of prison. And Luke is talking about the things that I wrote to you in my first book about the things that Jesus began to do and to teach. Wait a minute. That first book is telling us everything Jesus did and taught, right? That's what he began to do and to teach. The second book is what he's doing and teaching through his apostles. And I want you, Theophilus, to write the next volume, which is what Paul is going to do to spread the gospel to the Gentile world once you get him out of prison.
Right.
Okay, so you got those interesting possibilities going on there. But there's another clue, and that is in Mark chapter 9. You have 4 times in Mark's gospel, you've got him, Jesus talking about his own resurrection. Let me see if I can pull this up.
You're talking about the first passion prediction?
Yeah. Well, it's not the first. That's in Mark 8. But in Mark 9:32, after they come down from
from the
Mount of
Transfiguration.
Okay. Jesus was telling them once again that he had to, he was going to get betrayed, suffer, and die, and on the 3rd day rise from the dead.
Yeah, verse 30, beginning with verse 30.
Yeah. And then verse 32, it says, but they did not understand this word. They were ignorant of what he was talking about, and they were afraid to ask him.
Right.
Ephobunta.
Yes.
The same exact verb that's used in Mark 16:8.
Right.
The form is an imperfect. And as an imperfect, it's an open-ended verb. It's saying, and they were being afraid to ask him. And then that's the end of the pericope. It goes on to the next thing. Now, it was Robert Stein who wrote a nice commentary on Mark. He taught at Southern Baptist Seminary for many years, Princeton graduate, studied under Metzger, but he thought that the ending of Mark's gospel was lost. And that may well be the case, but I don't think so. I think Mark intended to end it at 16:8. And Stein said, the ending like that, where it just ends so unsatisfactorily, is a Kafka-like ending. Really? It's not ancient? There was a doctoral dissertation by a man named Lee Magnus who looked at open-ended conclusions to books and to stories in the ancient world. And one of them was, we have 2 in the Old Testament. One is Jonah, famously, Jonah chapter 4. He didn't want to go and talk to the Assyrians. He didn't want to talk to the Ninevites. And he's upset because he lost his shade, because the sun beat down, rather than being concerned about any of those who are on their way to hell. And so it's an irony in the end to say he didn't do what he did what God called him to do. But at the end, he was more concerned about himself than even the people he preached the gospel to. These women didn't do what they were supposed to do. All the way through Mark's gospel, Jesus says, don't tell people who I am. And what happens? They tell people who he is.
Right.
And it was Kelly Iverson who published an article in Catholic Biblical Quarterly a few years ago called Irony in the End. And he looked at Mark 16:8 with the ephah for they were continually being afraid. And he said, this is how Mark intends to end it. Ernest Best says Mark doesn't tell them stuff that they already knew typically. And you've got the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You've got Luke following the same pattern where the Acts starts with a bang and ends with a whimper of 8 chapters leading up to this trial before Caesar in Rome. And you never get there.
Yeah.
Is the ending lost, or is he asking Theophilus to write it in life to get Paul out of prison? Same thing with Mark. What are you going to do? You know, these women went and told the disciples. You know, the disciples told you, and he mentions even one of them who was a follower and now in Rome. And so Mark, I think, is saying, are you going to be afraid, or are you going to stand up for Jesus and proclaim the real gospel? And do you really know who he is? Are you ready to take up your cross and die for him?
Yeah.
So you got these little internal clues, and I think the very fact that you got that exact same verb, ephah, in Mark 9:32, it's an open-ended pericope, open-ended story.
Yeah.
With the same exact verb that you get in Mark 16:8.
Yeah.
The clues are there.
Definitely. That's remarkable. I mean, again, that's the view I hold to as well. The ironic, the sense of irony that Mark uses throughout his gospel, and it's, what are you going to do? The reader, what are you going to do? How are you going to respond to the resurrection of Jesus? And are you ready? And again, if Peter is the mentor, there's a very long history of Peter being the mentor of Mark, and that probably explains all the Aramaic words of Jesus in Mark as well. It's also interesting that Peter in his first epistle, he writes to persecuted Christians and tells them in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be ready to give an answer to those who ask you. Yeah. So,
which is the basis for your whole apologetics ministry, isn't it? 1 Peter 3:15.
That's right.
One of the great verses for that. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So, Dan, how are we doing on time? We're already, it's now 9:37 Eastern Standard.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to hold you. Is it okay if you take, let's say, I think there's 2 questions here. This one is people use the terms best and oldest to support their reading. What makes a manuscript best? And does older mean better or more reliable?
Older does not necessarily mean better or more reliable, but the older a manuscript is, there's, on a probabilistic basis, fewer copies between it and the original. The later the manuscript is, there's the likelihood that there's more copies between it and the original. So at the same time, we do know of some later manuscripts that are very, very good. One from the 10th century, Codex 1739. It's on Mount Athos in northeastern Greece, on the peninsula. And that manuscript is one that has it has patristic commentary in the margins all the way through, and it systematically quotes from church fathers that deal with the given passages in Paul. And what it does is it goes through the church fathers systematically right up until the 4th century, and then it stops. Why is that? Well, perhaps because the manuscript it was copying from was from the early 5th century or late 4th century. That's a good likelihood. In fact, we even know who the scribe of 1739 is. His name was Ephraim, and he was in Constantinople. He originally was trained to be a lawyer, but he decided to become a scribe, and he was one of the very best scribes we ever had. We know of 5 manuscripts that he wrote, 2 of the New Testament, 3 of classical texts. And Ephraim searched in the bowels of the library to find the oldest and best manuscripts he could and copied from those. So this is a manuscript that most scholars would say is equivalent to one of the great majuscule manuscripts of the 4th or 5th century. So here's a man that we know was going back for the best and oldest, and those 2 are equated in his mind. But let me just talk about how do we, but so what I'm saying is it's the exception that proves the rule, that normally it's the older manuscripts that are better, but that's not always the case. Okay. What do we know about these manuscripts? Why is something considered best? And it has to do with in places where we have moral certainty as to what the original wording is. And we see the manuscripts that have that wording. You know, there could be differences, and we say, oh, there's no way it could be this. This is what it likely is on the basis of internal evidence. Okay. Then that's how we see what a best manuscript is. So this is actually the approach that Westcott and Hort did originally. They mentioned this in their introduction, where they talked about looking at the readings that they considered on the basis of transcriptional and intrinsic probability. This is the reading that best explains the rise of the others. That's the criterion you use. What's the reading that best explains the rise of the others? Can you explain that this reading comes from that one, or that one comes from this one? And on the basis of what seemed to be very obvious in those places where it was really clearly obvious, say it was something like 8 out of 10 times when they did that, then they looked at the manuscripts, and it just so happened to be that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were on the side of the best readings on the basis of internal evidence almost all the time. Not always, but almost all the time. They overstated the case. So people think their approach was to just rely on these two 4th century majuscules. No, their method was to look at internal evidence and determine what's the best reading. And on that basis, then they determined these two manuscripts are very good. They actually said that Codex Bezae, a Western manuscript from the 5th century, early 5th, late 4th, perhaps, of the Gospels and Acts, that manuscript may have had an ancestry that goes older than what Aleph and B have, but it was a corrupt ancestry. And so they are recognizing it goes back to earlier sources, but it's not a great manuscript. It's untrustworthy for the most part. Mm-hmm. And even those who hold to majority text would recognize that Codex Bezae or Codex D is not a particularly trustworthy manuscript. So that's where the Reason Eclectics and majority text would have a strong agreement on these things. Right. So as you look at what is considered to be the best on the basis of internal evidence, and repeatedly you see that. So you say 8 out of 10 times, you say, I'm morally certain this is what the original is. Or let's say, I'm sorry, 8 out of 10 times they find that Aleph and B have what they consider to be original. And then there's a couple of times where they're not really sure on the basis of internal evidence. Well, that's when you say, I can't decide internally. I have to rely on the best witnesses that I have. So it's similar to this. Let's say I have, and any professor knows this. You have some students who are really, really good in the class, others who are really, really poor and struggling. And I taught Greek for 39 years, so I know about the two ends and those in the middle. And I could tell time after time after time who the best students were. In fact, what I did when I was grading the quizzes, and this is all objective material, I'd see the 3 or 4 really exceptional students in a class, and they come up with the same answer on something, and my answer key had something different. I began to question myself. Did I get it right? So I went back and I said, oh, they're right. I'm wrong. I have to go back and regrade the rest of these quizzes because I got it wrong, but they were the only ones who got it right. So that happened on a few occasions. But the point is that on the basis of internal evidence and on those who you trust, you can go back to them and say, in the case where I've got these two readings, which one is going to be considered original? And I'm not real sure on the basis of internal evidence. I have to go on the basis of external evidence. These students, I've had some who had a photographic memory. I had one student in the 39 years of teaching Greek who never missed a single thing on any quizzes or tests or papers in first year Greek. And I gave a quiz every single class. Never did he miss one thing. Wow. I've never had a student with that kind of a memory. Wow. So his, I could trust, you know. Right. So it's not just, oh, I think this is the best. No, there's a solid basis on the basis of what we know internally about what scribes do And we see that this is the reading that best explains the rise of the others.
Right.
Let me give an example here. Give two examples. In Philippians 1:14, Paul says something to the effect of most of the brothers. Let me just take a look at the text here real quick. If you have it in front of you, you can just read it so we don't have to take up my time. But
sure, let me just grab the New Testament here. Was that Philippians 1?
Oh, I got it. No worries.
You got it?
Philippians 1:14. So Paul is talking about, and most of the brothers, because they're confident in the Lord, because of my imprisonment. Let's see, I lost my place. Dare all the more to speak the word fearlessly. Okay. In the Greek, it's dare all the more to speak the word fearlessly. But between logon, the word, and laline, to speak, there's an insertion in the Nestle text. It says that there's a textual variant. And you look below and you see tu theou. Now, one of the things that I teach students is work with just the internal evidence first. And when I'm going to be publishing a book on textual criticism that talks about using internal evidence first. And without looking at the external, where you get biased because of, about these manuscripts, I ask the question, okay, what's more likely that they would say, that Paul would say, to speak the word of God fearlessly? We see tu theou there, or to speak the word fearlessly? Well, I would expect scribes to want to clarify. That's a known scribal proclivity. And it just so happens that the manuscripts that have tu theou are Aleph and B and a bunch of others, very important Alexandrian and Western manuscripts, but it's P46 and the majority texts that don't have tu theou. Here's a place where I'd say the Byzantine manuscripts, no earlier than the 9th century, but P46, it's from the early 3rd century, they don't have tu theou. That was an addition that was added later, and the original didn't have it. So you look at that and you say, okay, I'm looking at that on the basis, this is one of those places where I say the Byzantine text or the majority text trumps the Alexandrian, because the internal evidence is so compelling, I have to go in that direction. And that's fine. There's other places. Let me suggest, for example, Romans 8:1, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, period, in our best witnesses. Then you have later manuscripts that add, who do not walk according to the flesh, period. And then finally, you have the largest group that say, who do walk according to the Spirit. So there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. That addition, those two additions, almost surely, on their face, they look like clarifications. They look like, we don't like this absolute statement about grace, so we got to kind of tweak it just a little bit. And it just so happens that the Byzantine manuscripts add that. It's our oldest manuscripts that have the shorter reading, and it's not as clear, and yet maybe it is just as clear that if we are in Christ, there's zero condemnation of us because of what he has done for us. That's a great passage.
Amen.
So that's where internal evidence drives you. But there's several places where I think the majority text is right and the Alexandrian witnesses are incorrect. There's even a couple places where I think the Western manuscripts, Codex Bezae, has it right where others don't. But I'm looking at that on the basis of internal evidence that's overwhelming to me. So that's how I deal with all this.
Well, Dan, let's just deal one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Are there some important I don't know if that means positions for the reliability of the New Testament with the publication of Stoughton's commentary to the Greek New Testament?
I think this person means Houghton's commentary on the Greek New Testament. Hugh Houghton, it just came out. Important new positions for the reliability of the New Testament. I don't know if there's new positions per se. But perhaps what this person's talking about is what's called the Editio Critica Maior, the major critical edition that stands behind quite a few of our New Testament books now. This has been developed in Munster, Germany. They're the ones who've published the standard critical Greek New Testament for many decades. And the ECM, or Didia Critica Major, was an examination of all of the Greek manuscripts in the first millennium and recording what they had to say for a number of the books of the New Testament, as well as some church fathers and versions, but they focused on the Greek manuscripts. So they could have a record of all the variants through the first millennium, which is an astounding amount of work.
Yeah.
They started it first with the Catholic epistles back in the 80s. They updated that later. It came out later. And then they did, Acts and Mark and Revelation. Those are the books they've done so far. Matthew is coming out next. These are not for the faint of heart. The one for Revelation, I think it's 4 volumes, and it cost me $800.
Oh,
that's $800 US, which would be
wow.
about, I think, 4 million Canadian, right? Something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
pretty
I'm sorry,
much.
just bad jokes.
Hey, no, it's not a bad joke. It's reality.
Okay. Well, so they give all these variants, and they're doing this in conjunction with what's called the CBGM, or the coherence-based genealogical method, which has to do with a comparison using computers to see where these manuscripts line up, their agreement with each other, in the places where there are variations. There's really quite a few places in the New Testament where we don't have variants, but where there are variations, they're talking about the percentage of agreement might be 99% down to 60% or something. But that's talking about a relative number. If you were to talk about all the places where there could be variants, it would be in the millions, and then everything is, anyway, that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
So the coherence-based genealogical method, they do first the percentage of agreements, and then just a flat, strict, objective number. And then they do, that's pre-genealogical coherence. And then they look at internal evidence and decide what readings are most likely original on the basis of internal evidence. Now, they haven't been real clear as to what they are regarding as internal evidence, but it's pretty much the standard of what reasoned eclectics have used. And then they actually can print out, they create on a computer this genealogical tree of where these readings came from and what descended from what. We, as I said, we only have maybe 15 or so manuscripts where we know this is an exact copy of this manuscript. So how can you tell, if you don't have those kinds of exact direct copies, how these manuscripts relate to each other? Well, it's this huge genealogical spread that is absolutely fascinating and mind-numbing to think about. But they're doing this on the basis of very clear internal evidence, and then they're seeing what manuscripts tend to really tell us what the original is. So what they've got is, for example, the first book that came out was James by itself. And there were all of 2 differences that they printed from the earlier Nestle 27th edition. And so then they, for the Catholic epistles altogether, there's 34 differences from what they had previously. And, there's something like that for Mark and this kind of thing. So by doing this CBGM in conjunction with ECM, they're able to be more certain about what the original wording is. And it really tells us that they said, for the most part, it agrees with what they've done before. What scholars have come to the conclusion, this is what must be original. But a very interesting thing is they are learning to appreciate the Byzantine witnesses more than they had before. What's the majority text. And I've been a long advocate that the Byzantine witnesses should be regarded as very important, not as important for the most part as Alexandrian witnesses, but they are very important. And at times, by themselves, or with just a few other witnesses, they're going to contain the original wording. So this is giving us greater certainty, and it's a more scientific basis, although there's still some issues with it. But I would have to say, although that was not their intention to argue anything theologically, what it's producing is a text that we can be more confident about, that we've recovered the original wording. Right. So let me just conclude, if I can, with this. All of this, with these differences and things, we're not talking about major disruptions. We're talking about 2 passages that are 12 verses, other places, but there's not a single core doctrine, perhaps not any doctrine, that is in any jeopardy by these textual variants. If there are, it's going to be very, very, very minor outlier doctrines. Mm-hmm. The most I've found, and I'm sure there's others that are probably in this ball camp, is at Mark 9:29. It's not a matter of orthodoxy, but it's a matter of orthopraxy. Mm-hmm. That is, what's right action? How should we behave as Christians? And in Mark 9:29, when the disciples tried to cast out a demon of this little boy, that the demon kept tossing him into the fire, and the father comes to Jesus, and the disciples said, "Why couldn't we cast him out?" Jesus said, "This kind can only be cast out by prayer," or he says, by prayer and fasting. It's a really difficult decision to determine which one he said. Frankly, I lean towards just prayer, because scribes tended to clarify. Mm-hmm. And you have good witnesses on both sides, but on the internal evidence, I'd say just prayer is what he said. But I'm not sure. Now, I've actually been involved in a couple of house exorcisms. I'm sorry, I forgot the word. Not exorcisms of demons out of people, but where we saw very evident things that were going on in the house that were demonic. Things flying across the room and this kind of stuff. And I wasn't sure which wording was original. So I hedged my bet. I not only prayed, but I also fasted before I was involved in those.
Right.
And so I'm saying, well, that's not something that everybody, normal Christians, do every day. So that's the closest I could find to anything that where orthodoxy is affected. That's not real significant.
Right. Right. Well, Dr. Wallace, I so appreciate your time. We've been on almost 2.5 hours, and it just seems
I said it can only last an hour.
It just seems like it's just just started half an hour ago. Just the information, the level of information that you provided, it was just very, very important. Sorry, folks, some of you may have come in late. We're coming to the end of our live stream. I do want to mention Dr. Wallace's book, Greek Beyond the Basics. It's available at a reduced rate, I believe, on Amazon. Is that right, Dan? On Amazon?
Yeah, $25 on Amazon. I don't know how long that's going to last. But.
Yeah, so guys, get on Amazon and get that book. And so while I have your attention, I also have a book that I published. This is just a print copy, No King But Christ, The Collapse and Bankruptcy of Secular Worldviews. It deals with the contemporary world we live in as Christians and the challenges we have to our faith, the whole woke ideology, social justice.
I don't have that. Can you send me a copy?
Absolutely. We'll do that. Absolutely. We'll do that. And also another book I wrote, it's called Early Christian Creeds and Hymns. And so it deals with the various creeds and hymns that are embedded in the text of the New Testament.
Is that based on your doctoral thesis?
A little bit. My doctoral thesis, Dan, was this one. It's published by Peter Lang, Worship and the Risen Jesus and the Pauline Letters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. 2000, I think, 13. So
I'd really like to get both those. You just talk to me later about what I owe you and give you the address and all that. We can work that out.
No problem, Dan. We'll do that. So, folks, just want to thank you all for joining us. It's been just a lot of, for some it might be like drinking water from a fire hose, but a lot of very important information. Please share this with your friends. It's uploading to YouTube as we speak. And so a lot of very important information there. So, folks, thanks again for watching, and I really appreciate you all. May the Lord bless you all, and wishing you all a Merry Christmas. And until next time, God bless.
Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Tony.